Today we're going to start talking about schizophrenia. I hope to get finished with it, but if not, there might be a little tiny bit left for Monday, when I do believe we're going to continue with psychological disorders by talking about substance abuse. So I'm going to start by talking about the different kinds of symptoms of schizophrenia, both the positive symptoms and the negative symptoms. We have these two overarching categories, the positive symptoms being things that are present in people who have schizophrenia that are absent in quote normal people, versus the negative symptoms are things that are absent in people who are schizophrenic versus the people who are quote normal. The positive symptoms include delusions, so these false beliefs that are sometimes pretty fantastical. The hallucinations, where they mostly see or hear things that are not out in the environment or things that are not based in reality, but sometimes they do have smell or touch hallucinations as well, or taste. Disorganized speech. Your author actually starts out with a conversation between two schizophrenics, and if you read it, you can tell that they're not talking to each other, they're not talking about the same thing, and sometimes one of the people will just go from one topic to another, and that can be kind of typical in this sort of loose associations that they make in their heads, and then they make these kind of logical leaps that make sense to them, and so to those of us who aren't in their heads, it is disorganized, as well as disorganized behavior. So those are the positive symptoms, things that we see in people who have schizophrenia that we do not see in quote normal people. He does discuss here how difficult it can be to diagnose schizophrenia. Some of these things we see in other people, and I'm going to talk about the disorganized speech at least in one of the next few slides, but things like delusions and hallucinations, we see these as they can come from other etiologies where the person is not schizophrenic. So some certain substances, cocaine, methamphetamine, people who've taken those long enough, we can see some delusions and hallucinations in those people. We see delusions and hallucinations in people with Huntington's disease. He gives us a few additional examples where we can see some of these symptoms, and it can be, we need to know that one of those conditions does not exist before we diagnose somebody as schizophrenic. They also do have negative symptoms, these weak or absent signs of emotion. Schizophrenia actually means a split in the, I don't want to say in personality, but and it's really sometimes confused by people with dissociative identity disorder, or what we used to call multiple personality disorder. But that split that schizophrenia was named after was really the kind of split between the intellect, the kind of cognition of what's going on, and the emotional reaction. And a lot of that comes from this kind of really blunted affect, or a lack of signs of emotion. They sometimes have a weak or absent speech, depending on the type of schizophrenia. And I'm also going to talk at some point, I'm pretty sure, about how there are really different kinds of schizophrenia, and they have collapsed them all into one in the DSM-5, whereas they used to be split out into paranoid, catatonic, and different kinds of schizophrenia. But they're really, the people who have schizophrenia, it really has a uniqueness to it. And similarly, I think to autism, you can say when you've met one schizophrenic, you've met one schizophrenic, which is what we say about children with autism, as it's so unique and individualistic that it's difficult to collapse them into some category. But anyway, so sometimes we see absent or a lot less speech, and then oftentimes they have worse socialization. One of the things that we're going to see can help people with schizophrenia is just social skills training. And part of this is a lack of self-care. So they have a lack of really understanding of other people and how to socialize well, but they also have a lack of self-care, which can already have people in society have a lot of stigma against them just because they might not look clean, well-shaven, and like they're taking care of themselves very well. Usually, the negative symptoms are very stable over time, and the negative symptoms are difficult to treat. So we'll talk about treatments, but most of the treatments are really for the positive symptoms. They also have cognitive symptoms, which we can think of as negative symptoms, as they have limitations of thought and reasoning that are not central to the diagnosis, but are part of their not understanding a lot of what's going on. On average, they have slightly lower IQ, but again, this is on average, and you might remember the movie Beautiful Mind with Jonathan, about John Nash, who was brilliant, right? A brilliant mathematician. And so on average, they have a slightly lower IQ. We're going to see some brain abnormalities that are going to show why they have some difficulty with inhibiting the wrong response. We've talked about the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex a couple of times, why they have some difficulty understanding social cues, and then they also have difficulty in understanding and using abstract concepts. One idea of part of what's causing some of the disorganized speech and behavior is that a lot of this has to do with their working memory. We're going to see some in their lack of ability to really focus and maintain focused attention on something. We're going to see, as we move on, a lot of different just brain abnormalities, areas that are underactive, overactive, reduced connectivity, or abnormal connectivity. One is the reduced connectivity between the sensory areas of the cortex and the hippocampus. So one study by John Kearns in 2007, he made healthy people talk and behave in incoherent ways by overtaxing their working memory. Okay, and this sounds like one of those nightmare studies that I would not want to do because I don't like multitasking as it is. But you can see how you feel you might do in this. People are given a series of pictures, and you have to tell a story about each of the pictures. If a picture comes up a second time, you cannot tell the same story. So remember, you've already told a story, and you have to inhibit that in order to come up with a new story about the picture. At the same time, they are doing a task where they have to pay attention to every second letter. And if it's the same as the last letter that you attended to, then you're supposed to press a button. So we're going to go through an example here of DL. L is the second letter. KF, F, RF. That just repeated from the last one I paid attention to. So yes, I pressed the button. BL, MT, JT. I press the button. KXH, HQ. I've already messed up. And that's actually what I thought I would not be able to not press the button for the BRB. You can see where I've already messed up, and I would press the button there, but you have to, so you're supposed to be paying attention to the second letter, and so you would not be paying attention to that first B. I was trying to give the accent on the one that I want to pay attention to. You're not supposed to pay attention to that first B, and so even though the next B is repeated, you don't press the button because those weren't the ones you were supposed to be paying attention to. Okay, so that's a hard enough task, but that's really not what they're paying. That's not what the researchers were interested in, was how well you do at that task. You're also, remember, as you're doing that task, which again already sounds hard just on its own, you're telling stories about a series of pictures. And if people are telling a story about a new picture, it's okay. They're not doing a great job. But if a picture comes up a second time, so that they have to inhibit that first story, they can't tell the same story, that's when they start to sound a lot like a schizophrenic person in having very disorganized speech, and they're not telling coherent stories. And so now we're seeing we're making healthy people behave like schizophrenics in this really cognitively overloading task. I'm going to run through some basic demographics that mostly come from your book, but maybe a couple of things from other textbooks. Worldwide, it appears to be about 1% of the people are schizophrenic. I think your author actually says it's half of 1%, but so we're going to say somewhere between 0.5% and 1% of the people have schizophrenia. It does seem to be declining and seems to be less severe than historically. However, I think a lot of that is it's difficult to tell with changes in diagnosis, and especially as we have learned more about other possible diagnoses that can be confused with schizophrenia. So I honestly think the drug-induced schizophrenia used to be assumed that that was schizophrenia, but now they realize that these people who have substance abuse disorders might be using drugs that are causing those delusions and hallucinations, and so all things like that are going to change diagnoses. It occurs in all ethnic groups and all parts of the world. There doesn't appear to be any particular ethnicity or race where we see more schizophrenia. It is more common in cities than in rural areas. Your author says this is most likely due to environmental pollutions and toxins and so forth, as we're going to see that those are potentially parts of the problem, although a lot of those problems are very much whether they are intermediate or low in correlation with schizophrenia. We don't see anything that's really highly correlated with schizophrenia, but we do see more environmental pollutions and toxins in cities than in rural areas, but we also might see more social stress in some ways. So it's, again, it's hard to tell what's going on exactly there, but it's definitely more common in cities than rural areas. It is 10 to 100 times more common in the United States and Europe than in developing nations. Again, why this is and whether this is partly diagnosis and partly potentially stigma in a lot of those developing nations, or just that there is nowhere to really get good medical care, those are certainly questions. And I have underneath that social support as being really important. The social support in those developing nations, because they are more interconnected and collectivistic, is different than in the United States and in Europe. And this is not including those other developed nations. So that's sort of a question too, where all of that lands. But the developing nations don't really have as many doctors, so there might not just be as many people going to get help. And then another thing I have mentioned here again is the omega-3s and BDNF and how important both of those things are. So those omega-3 fatty acids appear to at least help and mitigate schizophrenia. And then also we see some problems with the hippocampus. So we also see if we can help raise brain-derived neurotrophic factor, this can help. But neither of these things is going to cure someone with schizophrenia. It's just going to mitigate some of the symptoms. Schizophrenia is more common in men than in women by a ratio of 7 to 5, and men usually have an earlier onset. So this is usually something that we see that comes along during adolescence, and especially for men, for boys, they're having this earlier in their adolescence and maybe in their early 20s. For women, it's more likely to occur in their late 20s. So whatever's happening that men are having this earlier onset, we also see people who have an earlier onset have more severe schizophrenia. So if we look at people, there are people who have another time when you might start to show schizophrenic symptoms is in your mid to late 40s. And those people, while they have schizophrenia and they have the symptoms, they don't appear to be as severe. And particularly for the boys, the men who then had this onset quite early, the earlier in the adolescence, the worse. Your author does list many mysteries, and I think I have all or most of them listed here. You can pause this and you can read this. I'm not going to go through them all. Part of my point in having the many mysteries is it is a pretty mysterious mental disorder, and these don't fit neatly into any box, and they don't really inform us as to what's going on with people who have schizophrenia or why they have schizophrenia, or what the relationship is between these mysteries and schizophrenia. But so it is less common in people with type 1 diabetes, more common in people with type 2 diabetes, so that diabetes that comes later in life and is more environmentally driven, most likely. Women who have a schizophrenic breakdown during pregnancy usually give birth to girls. Those who have a breakdown shortly after birth usually give birth to boys. Again, what all of that means is I'm not really sure. We don't know. They are producing a particular chemical, which gives them a characteristic body odor, and they have a decreased ability to smell that chemical themselves. And as I've mentioned before, when we talked about eye movements, they have difficulty with pursuit eye movements. Instead of making a pursuit eye movement, they are not completely focusing on that, and they are making short saccadic movements in order to keep up with something that they are pursuing in time, in space. And so do many of their undiagnosed family members. I think I mentioned this before as well, so I want to get on an eye tracker and see. I think I had this and their undiagnosed family members from a previous edition of CALET. And then I read somewhere else it's more like 75% of undiagnosed family members. And again, what this is unclear, and whether the family members are learning this from a family member who has schizophrenia, or are this is something that is genetic. It's unclear. Schizophrenia is another one of those mental disorders where we cannot point to a single gene. So we talked about Huntington's disease and how we can point to chromosome 4 and exactly where we're going to see the mutations of what causes that. But with schizophrenia, I think I'm going to talk about this again, so I'm not going to talk about it too much here, but it appears to be 100 or hundreds of genes involved, where we might have some mutation or a microdeletion, some small absence in those genes. It makes it much more likely for people to have schizophrenia in particular genes, but we don't know what they are. There's no gene we're pointing to, but it does appear to have a genetic basis. Monozygotic twins have a higher concordance rate than dizygotic twins, and we can see this is a nice kind of probabilities of developing schizophrenia based on how many relations you have and who those relations are. So the children of 2 schizophrenic parents are pretty likely. If we move to dizygotic twins are more likely than other siblings, and we will talk about the importance of environment, and particularly for schizophrenia, it's very clear that prenatal environment is really important. Children of schizophrenic mothers, even when they're adopted by non-schizophrenic mothers, are more likely to be schizophrenic. And we can see, again, in the general population, it's estimated at about 1%. So another kind of listing of aspects of genetics, because again, it's a pretty complicated disorder of what's going on and why we're seeing it. Adopted children are more likely to become schizophrenic if their biological relatives have schizophrenia. So if I'm adopted and I have schizophrenia, 12.5% of my biological family, that's in this study, that's the percentage they found, are going to have schizophrenia, and none of my adopting family. If I'm remembering correctly, this was a large study conducted in Norway or Sweden or somewhere like that. So really not, this makes it look like it's really not environmental as we're doing those concordance rates, but it's really not that straightforward. We really are inheriting a genetic predisposition, and there appears to almost need to be some dysfunction in the family for us to see that predisposition come to fruition. So there's an interaction between the child having a schizophrenic mother and the amount of dysfunction in the adopting family, when they've looked at those adoption studies. If we look at genetics or the specific genes, again, there are I think he estimates 100, but it used to be said dozens. Now that says 100, hundreds. We don't know how many genes are involved with schizophrenia, and there is not a gene that they point to and say this is the one. But that being said, and you might notice this or know this for autism as well, that they have the same kind of, we don't know. We think there might be hundreds of genes, maybe over 100 genes. And while we're not pointing to any, we do point to one or two in autism. Well, the one that we point to as what appears to be the strongest gene that we can see is DISC1, as they call it, which stands for disrupted in schizophrenia 1. And this gene controls the production of dendritic spines and generation of new neurons in the hippocampus. Other genes that we see as linked to schizophrenia are important for brain development as well, and glutamate specifically, and then connections between the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. Again, it's only in about 1% of the population. And if we look at this, people with schizophrenia tend to die younger and have fewer children on average than, quote, normal people. And their siblings are not compensating. Their siblings are not having more children in order to compensate for people with schizophrenia who inherit and then show the disorder of schizophrenia, dying young and having fewer children, which means that we would expect to see this eventually die out of the population as we see how natural selection works. But that's why they're saying, that's why they started looking towards more and more possible genes and looking for other explanations. And so other explanations include new gene mutations as an explanation, as well as I have here microdeletions and microduplications, but my understanding and from what I've heard from people, they've noticed those microdeletions where there's just a bit of the gene that is just missing. Okay, so a nucleotide that's just missing. So mutations in a single gene are pretty rare, but if we decide that there are hundreds of genes, this is going to be not so rare. We all have a likelihood of some slight mutation or a microdeletion in our genetics, and it just doesn't change any really coding of proteins. But if we're looking at a particular set of genetics, so the hundreds of genes potentially involved in schizophrenia, then that's not so rare, and it might give us the genetic predisposition. So researchers found microdeletions and microduplications in 5% of a control group, 15% of schizophrenics, and then 20% of schizophrenics with onset before age 18. So we do see some relationship, but again, just some percentages to consider. So I am ending this PowerPoint here, and then I'll start the second one from today in the middle of talking about environment, but I did not want to just leave it at genetics and then break that up in any way, because we are inheriting a predisposition with our genetics, and it takes a number of things to occur for us to actually develop the mental disorder of schizophrenia. And the neurodevelopmental hypothesis, I think, is crucial, is key for understanding schizophrenia. Schizophrenia really appears to begin with abnormalities in the development of the nervous system in the prenatal and neonatal environment. So this means that we have a brain that is developed to an extent where it's vulnerable to other disturbances later in life. And we're going to talk about some of the environmental links to schizophrenia, but remember, we are not just getting the genetic predisposition, but we have a brain that is developed and to already have some abnormalities and is invulnerable to becoming schizophrenic. So we're going to look at several kinds of prenatal or neonatal difficulties that are linked to later having schizophrenia. We know that people with schizophrenia have minor brain abnormalities that apparently originate early in life and we will see why those abnormalities, we really don't see the clear symptomology until puberty. And it is certainly plausible that abnormalities of early development could impair behavior into adulthood.